Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ramiro from ANTICONQUISTA. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today is political education session number 7, What is to be Done by Vladimir Lenin. Couldn't have come at a better time because we're in the wake of these bullshit elections here in the United States, where we're presented with these false options of the Democrats and the Republicans. And so today's political education session will serve as an introduction to Lenin, who's one of the seminal communist writers that we should all be studying and familiarize ourselves with. And he provides some revolutionary solutions to poverty, to war, which we're experiencing every day. And today, our guest is Alexia Isais. Alexia is a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL. Shout out to PSL, based in Phoenix, and a student of political science and history at Arizona State University. How's it going, Alexia?
It's going good.
So, Alexia, what do you, first of all, before we get into the reading, again, we're reading from the Lenin Anthology. This is edited by Robert Tucker, and we're going to be reading What is to be Done, a few excerpts. What do you think about these 2020 elections? Are you as sick of them as I am?
Yeah, I think all of us are a little bit sick of them at this point. I mean, I think I just saw the other day on Twitter that Alaska was called for Trump, and everyone was like at that point pretty much over it. So yeah, I mean, it's been a really long election, but I think that it's been one where we've been able to learn a lot from in terms of how we view it as radicals, as Marxists. Because now we're able to spread our message a lot in a way where we can actually demonstrate with real life examples like happening right in front of us. So I think, some good has come out of it despite all of its, longevity and stuff like that.
By the way, shout out to Colorful Outcast and Leon Friedrich in the chat. What's up, everybody who's listening to this as a podcast as well. For me, I think the elections have demonstrated the false nature of this two-party system, the fact that the Democrats had someone like Joe Biden, who's a pedophile, a predator, an imperialist, probably a drug addict. And you have someone like Donald Trump, who's the same thing, a capitalist, someone who oppresses people of color, who is backed by the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex. And the analogy I gave the last time during one of our discussions on this podcast was that we were presented with two options of soda. It's kind of like if you're going to your friend's house and your friend's like, hey, do you want something to drink? Do you want Coke or Pepsi? And you're like, I want neither. I want water. Like, they're both bad for you, And then some people, like one group of friends is like saying, no, Coke is better. And the other one's like, no, Pepsi is better. And it's like, they're both fucked up for you. Like, they're both going to fuck you up. And I think with 2020, like, that's something that has been revealed, is the fact that either way we're fucked. Biden is already talking about in his transitional team appointing people who supported the Iraq war. He himself supported the invasion of Iraq. He wants to continue sanctions against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, Cuba. And so this facade, this theater that we're constantly fed into of like, vote Democrat, like things will get better. We have to get the main guy out. It's been played over and over and over. And again, we also heard the same bullshit of like, this is the most important election in our lifetime. Like, they've been saying that shit since forever, and I think finally people are beginning to wake up to that. And before also we get into the work, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about what PSL has been doing around the election.
Yeah, well, I guess a little before that, we've been organizing with the Black Lives Matter movement that's been happening as of recent, trying to make that an issue that doesn't just head to the back burner or get, co-opted by Democrats and, ends up in the graveyard of all these movements where they kind of just, take it and make it into a very reformist sort of movement. But, we've been trying to keep up with that. And I guess organizing for, survival programs. So one we did here in Phoenix was a survival program not too long ago to help out with PPE, help out with the, people suffering from the COVID pandemic. And yeah, other stuff based around, I guess need and political education and agitation.
Yeah, no, that's the best thing I think people can do is like maintain that political activity, political consciousness, serving the people, because that's something that happens year round. It's funny because all of these liberals try to shame you once a year or once every 4 years to be like, oh, you're not voting Democrat? Like, how dare you? Are you not political? And it's like, as communists, we're the most political people out there, but we're so political that we don't put all our eggs in this one basket of bourgeois electoral reform. And that's what kind of we'll go into a little bit with Lenin's work, what is to be done. Shout out to Anthony Reyes, shout out to Volti, shout out to everybody who's watching, listening on ANTICONQUISTA. To give everybody some background on what is to be done by Lenin, again, this is from the Lenin anthology. What is to be done is one of Lenin's earliest works. For those who aren't familiar with Lenin, he was a leader of the Russian Revolution in 1917 that came to power with the Bolshevik Party and later became the Soviet Union. What is to be done was written at the end of 1901 and published in 1902. The work was written by Lenin in response to other members of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And so at the time, the Social Democrats in Russia were one big party that had a bunch of different tendencies. You had like reformists, revolutionaries, you had people who anarchists. There were people of all different strands in this one giant tent. So throughout the work, you'll hear Lenin refer to social democrats. So we have to keep in mind that it's not the same kind of social democrats that we understand now, like Bernie Sanders or AOC and other people, but it's in that context, it had a different meaning. And so in 1898, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was formed to unite all of the revolutionary organizations of the Russian Empire. Up until that time, Russia had been ruled by the Romanov dynasty for hundreds of years under a feudal monarchy that was backwards as fuck, that was reactionary as fuck, that had women weren't even allowed to go to school or anything like that. And so around this time period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're talking about, a few decades after the death of Marx, you had the growth of revolutionary activism and politics, the growth of socialism. And so in 1912, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which Lenin was a member of, it split into the Bolsheviks, which in Russian means majority, and the Mensheviks, which means minority in Russian. And the names originate from an important vote that took place on the question of party membership. The Bolsheviks sided with Lenin and were the majority, and the reformist minority were called the Mensheviks, and they sided with a man named Julius Martov. The Bolsheviks promoted what we call revolutionary socialism, a socialism that seeks to overthrow the actually existing capitalist system, replace it with something new. The Mensheviks were reformists. They wanted to work within the system, make little reforms here and there, make intersectional capitalism, or what we would call it today. And Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, was a Menshevik until just a few weeks before the success of the Russian Revolution. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. And so this work that we're talking about today, what is to be done, it's so important. It was the platform of what became known as Bolshevism. This is the platform of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which lasted for decades. And in What is to be Done, Lenin argues that the working class will not spontaneously become political only by fighting economic battles with employers over wages, working hours, and other reforms. But instead, Lenin said that in order to educate the working class on Marxism, Marxists should form a political party, a vanguard party of dedicated revolutionaries in order to spread Marxist political ideas among the workers. And he confronted what he described as the economist trend in Russian social democracy that we were talking about before, that followed the line of someone named Edward Bernstein. And now Edward Bernstein was a German social democrat who was a member of the German Social Democratic Party. He was actually homies with Karl Marx and Engels, but he eventually, after Marx and Engels died, Edward Bernstein began shifting to the right once the German state began, offering concessions to the Social Democratic Party. He was saying, let's work within the system, let's present these little changes to help workers. And so Lenin was critiquing Bernstein and the Mensheviks, who supported this kind of reformist wing of socialism. And he referred to them as economists and also opportunist. And later on, eventually, they also became to known as revisionists because they revised the theories of Marx. Marx was a revolutionary socialist. He believed that the only way to get rid of capitalism was to overthrow it, not work within it. And so that's a little bit what we're going to be talking about today, the difference between evolutionary socialism and revolutionary socialism, which is all the focus of what is to be done by Vladimir Lenin. Alexia, just maybe before I read a passage from Lenin's work, I don't know if you have any comments or questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to reiterate what you've already said for the most part, is that, this is a very foundational document, and that it lays out, I guess, two major functions, the need for a party and the need to establish that, the working class is capable of organizing and speaking for itself. We didn't need like these, sort of soft academics or economists to sort of make these decisions for us. Lenin's sort of point was, that we can do this on our own, and we're capable. We're not just we don't just need to be given like what's considered to be palpable. We also can are able to sort of understand these theories and to organize along Marxist theory and whatnot.
Definitely, most definitely. Anthony Reyes said Biden's team looks worse than Trump's. For real, his team looks fucking whack. I mean, they're both whack, but Biden is what is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Shout out to Dust James. He said, "Good evening, all. Glad to share this out. Spot on with the farce of the elections for sure." Julian said, "Love these political education sessions." Shout out to Julian. Shout out to Implicate World Order. Cool. So let's move on to portion one of what is to be done. There are 5 parts in what is to be done. We're going to just read excerpts from 4 parts that are some of the more crucial areas. And so I'm going to read you an excerpt from part 1, which is called Dogmatism and Freedom of Criticism. Lenin says, 2 trends have taken form in present-day international social democracy. The conflict between these trends now flares up in a bright flame and now dies down and smolders under the ashes of imposing, quote, truce resolutions. The essence of the new trend, which adopts a critical attitude towards, quote, obsolete dogmatic Marxism, has been clearly enough presented by Bernstein and demonstrated by Millerand. Social democracy must change from he's saying, Lenin is saying what Bernstein is saying. Social democracy must change from a party of social revolution into a democratic party of social reforms. Bernstein has surrounded this political demand with a whole battery of well-tuned, quote, new arguments and reasonings. Denied was the possibility of putting socialism on a scientific basis and of demonstrating its necessity and inevitability from the point of view of the materialist conception of history. Denied was the fact of growing impoverishment, the process of proletarianization, and the intensification of capitalist contradictions. The very concept, the ultimate aim, was declared unsound, and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was completely rejected. Denied was the antithesis in principle between liberalism and socialism. Denied was the theory of the class struggle on the alleged grounds that it could not be applied to a strictly democratic society governed according to the will of the majority. And Lenin goes on to say, he who does not deliberately close his eyes cannot fail to see that the new critical trend in socialism is nothing more nor less than a new variety of opportunism. And if we judge people not by the glittering uniforms they don or by the high-sounding appellations they give themselves, but by their actions and what they actually advocate, it will be clear that freedom of criticism means freedom for an opportunist trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. Freedom is a grand word, but under the banner of freedom for industry, the most predatory wars were waged. Under the banner of freedom of labor, the working people were robbed. The modern use of the term freedom of criticism contains the same inherent falsehood. The Bernsteinian and critical trend to which the majority of, quote, legal Marxists turned deprived the socialists of this opportunity and demoralized the socialist consciousness by vulgarizing Marxism, by advocating the theory of blunting social contradictions, by declaring the idea of the social revolution and of the dictatorship of the proletariat to be absurd, by reducing the working class movement and the class struggle to narrow trade unionism and to a, quote, realistic struggle for petty gradual reforms. This was synonymous with bourgeois democracy's denial of socialism's right to independence and consequently of its right to existence. In practice, it meant a striving to convert the nascent working class movement into an appendage of the liberals. What would you think about that excerpt?
Well, firstly, I think it was really beautifully written. I mean, just kind of the way we can kind of easily understand what he's talking about. He's talking about, Bernstein and his ideas, which, really, like he said, put a blunt to revolutionary theory and revolutionary socialism, and sort of made it a more reformist sort of socialist theory. But Lenin says, while you have the freedom to criticize my socialism, I also have the theory to criticize how I think you're actually misconstruing what socialism really is, and how you're essentially just stripping the revolutionary character away from this inherently revolutionary theory. So and I think in the next part of that excerpt, he makes this really good he gives us a picture of people marching forward together, holding hands, and they're headed towards a march. And in this situation, there's people who are saying, "Oh yeah, let's go towards the march." And then Lenin's like, "Well, you guys can go to the march. We're gonna go this way. We're gonna criticize how you want to go this reformist way. We're not going to go into the march. We're going to lead into a place that's, where we actually think we should be going as a working class." And so I think that's a really good depiction of what he's trying to say there.
Yeah, that's a great point, because a lot of times, like, these social democrats, these reformists, they constantly, what they do is, like, they harness the energy of the people, right? Real concerns that people have: poverty, unemployment, police terror, racism. They understand that, they identify it, but they always bring it back to the Democratic Party. They always bring it back to the same dead end, and they redirect the people into the march, like you were talking about. And it's fucked up, because you're going against the people's best interests by understanding the people's concerns, but purposefully misdirect. It's like giving someone bad directions. I think that march, I'm so glad you pointed out that march example, because it's kind of like someone's like, "Hey, which way is, like, the hospital? I have an emergency." And you're like, "Oh yeah, it's the other way down there." They're like, "What the fuck? Like, that's fucked up," because you understand, like, that's an emergency situation. They urgently need to get taken care of, but you're sending them the opposite way. And so it just goes to show you how these liberals, these social democrats, are so misleading, and how they always bring back this revolutionary momentum into the mainstream parties. I also wanted to ask you, before we get into the next segment of this book, what are your thoughts on this term of, quote unquote, democratic socialism?
Just in general, like how we're using it today.
Yeah. Like in the US,
Yeah.
like, how if someone says, "I'm not a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist," what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see where people come from when they say, like, I identify as a democratic socialist, because even before I was a Marxist Leninist, I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm a democratic socialist." But that was, I guess, before I realized, like, hey, actually this theory is, like, inherently democratic. It doesn't
Exactly.
need to be given this this adjective of democratic, because it's already within the contents of it. When you read about Marxism, it's about workers' ownership. It's about actually implementing what democracy really is. And so it doesn't need that democratic in front of it, because like I said, it's inherent within it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And part of socialist organizing and socialist politics is direct democracy. And people always want to add these adjectives to socialism: eco-socialism, democratic socialism. And it's like socialism already encapsulates all of that. But the fact that people feel the need to add that, it just totally blunts it. So just looking through the chat, some people were saying Biden was trying to be more belligerent than Trump in the last debate. Someone asked, "New to the Phoenix, Glendale area, drop some orgs, or really anywhere I can donate to." Maybe we can, what do you think about that, Alexia?
Yeah, we have organizations like mutual aid organizations that are in the area. You could donate to. Also, I think International Rescue or one of those organizations are good to donate to. I would actually have to think about it more. Like maybe we could I could write them down and then we can discuss after, or I can just list them out.
Sounds good. And also Volti said liberal elites, yes, liberal working classes being a bit naive because of capitalist realism. So we're going to go into part 2 of what is to be done. This part is called the spontaneity of the masses and the consciousness of the social democrats. Lenin says, since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course, for mankind has not created a third ideology. And moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology, to its development along the lines of the Credo program. For the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism. And trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. Hence, our task, the task of social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. And Lenin goes on to say, we have become convinced that the fundamental error committed by the, quote, new trend in Russian social democracy is its bowing to spontaneity, and its failure to understand the spontaneity of the masses demands a high degree of consciousness from us social democrats. The greater the spontaneous upsurge of the masses and the more widespread the movement, the more rapid, incomparably so, the demand for the greater consciousness in the theoretical, political, and organizational work of social democracy. The spontaneous upsurge of the masses in Russia proceeded and continues with such rapidity that the young social democrats proved unprepared to meet these gigantic tasks. This unpreparedness is our common misfortune, the misfortune of all Russian social democrats. The upsurge of the masses proceeded and spread with uninterrupted continuity. It not only continued in the places where it began, but spread to new localities and to new strata of the population. And then Lenin talks about political agitation. And so I think what's interesting about that section is what he refers to as bowing to spontaneity, and this concept of the social democrats, or as we would call them today, socialists or revolutionaries, just kind of following what the crowd does, right? Just seeing the protest. And I've seen some of this, like I've seen some people on the left who just kind of tail behind the masses. And what Lenin is saying is that we shouldn't just tail behind the masses. We should be with the masses and move them in a direction with them, alongside them in a revolutionary way, away from just reforms, but toward real radical changes. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that section as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one is a really important point, especially with the kind of things we're seeing right now. Developing as we see, like the Black Lives Matter movements developing, and the uprising that we had this summer. I think I want to backtrack a little bit to the first part of the excerpt that you read aloud, which was about how you can either go one way or the other. You're either for socialism or you're against it. And when these spontaneous things happen, it's going to either sink into this bourgeois electoralism and liberalism. It's going to be kind of like essentially swallowed by it, or it's going to go in the direction of socialism. And that's where I think Lenin is saying our role comes in as as people who are supposed to be a part of the working class and who are supposed to be leading the working class, as people who come from that class. And we want to obviously not bow down to the spontaneity, but be there in times when these spontaneous things are not happening. There's also work that needs to be done in between, non-revolutionary times, as I believe he's mentioned before in other works as well. That work needs to be done before, and you need to be educating and agitating at a time when spontaneity isn't happening. And also, if you kind of bow down to spontaneity, it's never certain that you're going to come out with you're going to come out victorious. I think we can look at the yellow vest protests and look at how France is very much a country where these types of spontaneous uprisings happen all the time, but because they don't have a cohesive socialist program or socialist consciousness, it's more of a liberal consciousness. It's more of it's kind of revolutionary in nature, but at the same time, it's kind of that revolutionary nature is being like kind of sucked out by liberal co-opting of it, and also the government's always like giving into the small reforms and saying like, here's your piecemeal and whatnot. So I think that a central part of it is making sure that as revolutionaries, that we can not only be a part of, I guess, the spontaneous movements, but also the movements in between, and just building towards a revolutionary movement in general, not just these small little pop-ups of revolutionary moments.
That's very well said. And we always have to be preparing ourselves, studying, organizing, creating the infrastructure for revolutionary movements. And something that Lenin talks about in other works later on, this is one of Lenin's earlier works. Later on, he talks about the importance of dual power and the importance of creating institutions that provide services for the people where they no longer have to depend on the bourgeoisie. And I think that's where things like mutual aid and serving the people, like the programs that you're doing and PSL is doing in terms of like distributing food and organizing the people. And in the Soviet Union, in the lead up to the Russian Revolution, they were doing that with the Soviets, where people would meet up, like it would be entire families who would show up to the Soviets. They would get food there, they would get childcare, they would get political education. And so it was kind of like a one-stop shop for people to be able to come together and get the things that they need as they were urgently struggling to survive. And it's also what the Panthers are doing as well, in the US with their free breakfast program, with their political education programs, where they were giving people direct services. And that's sort of the daily work that a lot of communists like yourself, like all of us do, but doesn't really get shown a lot of times, because a lot of times the liberals, the Democrats, they run these NGOs. I think it's fascinating that the United States has more NGOs than any other country on the planet. And I think the one of the reasons for that is to really try to hinder any revolutionary momentum, because when you have an NGO industrial complex and this get out the vote industrial complex, you're able to pacify people. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of what Lenin is saying happening right before our eyes. We're seeing like again, like the swallowing of these revolutionary movements into a more pacifistic, reformist, electoral, bourgeois direction. And obviously, our role in that is to make sure it goes the other way. And these sort of campaigns to. I remember just seeing constantly during election season, vote all caps from people just constantly. And I think a challenge to that we could say is, what happens after you vote, and like what happens when your candidate loses, or what happens when in 4 years, let's say Biden is replaced by Donald Trump again, or like something crazy happens. You can't ever create something as permanent as you can with revolution, than with electoralism. So I think just always pointing out those contradictions are very important, those contradictions within electoralism and reformism, and also emphasizing the role of socialist consciousness, as what Lenin says in this book and in future works, is that, our work is to, again, educate, not just participate, but also to educate. And, I think in moments like this and in live streams like this is kind of one of those exact same ways that we can actually, educate and bring about this socialist consciousness.
Most definitely. And I think a good point that you mentioned that I also wanted to talk a little bit more about is the role of elections in communist organizing, because I think what's beautiful about Lenin, he talks about this in What Is to Be Done, but more specifically also in State and Revolution, that communists don't necessarily say fuck all elections. Like, I think that's something that is important to keep in mind, is that communists should use elections as a base for organizing. We understand that elections are not the end all be all, right? Because there are kind of like these two trends, right? You have the liberal Democrats who are saying, vote, your voice, you know, and they're just like, vote, 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 this constant badgering. And that's the only exercise of political power that they understand. But you also have this other wing, the anarchist wing, that are like, fuck everything, fuck all elections, fuck all political parties. And they're just like crying about everything. And it's just like, communists, we take a scientific understanding, right? We have a scientific outlook of politics. We understand that politics are part of the superstructure of the economic base of society, that under capitalism, the capitalist class controls politics. And so, yeah, if we participate in these bourgeois electoral reforms, we're probably not going to get very far because the capitalists run the political system. However, that being said, communists should use elections as a starting point for beginning to get the word out. Like, I know, actually, it's funny because one of the first times I heard about socialism was through when I think it was in 2012 when I first voted, and I saw Gloria La Riva and PSL, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, and at that time, I wasn't even a socialist or communist yet. Like, I was just beginning to get into that. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Party for Socialism and Liberation. I looked it up, and then I just kept looking and looking. And it was interesting because that opens your mind. And that's not, you know, I understand, like, parties like PSL and other groups, they're not under the illusion that they're going to win, you know, the US election. But it's an organizing tactic because you also don't want to separate yourself from the masses, right? You also don't want to be like, fuck everybody, fuck everything. I'm going to be in my corner and cry and, you know, build autonomy in my little corner. Like, that's not going to work. You have to be where the masses are at. And I think that's exactly what Lenin talks about here. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think actually that's perfectly right. The way that communists view elections is, again, it's not in this way where it's like, you know, fuck all elections. We don't need to even focus like what is voting. It's totally different approach than that. And I think I like how you mentioned, you know, Gloria La Riva, and why we run our own candidates, knowing, you know, like, you know, we know that they're not going to win because we live in a dictatorship of the rich, the bourgeoisie, and we know that a two-party system is not necessarily friendly towards third parties, especially communist parties. So the reason why we run candidates is because we know that every 4 years, when people are most polarized, when people are looking at politics the most is during these times, because unfortunately we've been conditioned to, you know, only pay attention to politics just these every 4 years. And I do think that's unfortunate. It is something that, you know, we have to take initiative in. We have to say, you know, we're going to run our own candidates because, you know, people become disillusioned with the Democrats, and they become disillusioned with the Republicans because, you know, they're like, why is this Democrat who supposedly represents me talking about how she wants to, you know, not protect my labor rights, or why is this Democrat talking about how she wants to lock people in cages, you know? And so people become disillusioned, rightly so, because these are very bourgeois politicians. They are not for their interests, you know, they're not for the working class. And so bringing, you know, communist participation within these elections is a way that you can educate people and let them know, like, hey, there is an alternative. And it takes a broader step aside from bourgeois electoral politics, and it says, you know, you can agitate, you can be on the front lines, you can participate in survival programs, you can you know, make comrades, you can understand and work with them the ways that the capitalist system sort of suppresses us, and then you eventually, you know, work towards building a stronger party and stuff like that. And so it's sort of a rabbit hole that you fall in, you know. I think when you see you know, that there are alternative options, and you wonder, like, why isn't this why can't Gloria La Riva, for example, win? You know, you start wondering, like, what I thought this was a democracy, why can't she win, sort of thing. So yeah,
that's well said. It's like being with the people as they process that and not just being like, oh, fuck you, but you're like helping them to understand the bigger picture. I think that's the correct approach. So part 3 of what is to be done, again, this is the Lenin anthology, edited by Robert Tucker. What is to be done, published in 1902. Part 3 is called Trade Unionist Politics and Social Democratic Politics. And Lenin says, quote, social democracy leads the struggle of the working class, not only for better terms for the sale of labor power, but for the abolition of the social system that compels the propertyless to sell themselves to the rich. Social democracy represents the working class, not in its relation to a given group of employers alone, but in its relation to all classes of modern society and to the state as an organized political force. Hence, it follows that not only must social democrats not confine themselves exclusively to the economic struggle, but that they must not allow the organization of economic exposures to become the predominant part of their activities. We must take up actively the political education of the working class and the development of its political consciousness. The question arises, what should political education consist in? Can it be confined to the propaganda of working class hostility to the autocracy? Of course not. It is not enough to explain to the workers that they are politically oppressed, any more than it is to explain to them that their interests are antagonistic to the interests of the employers. Agitation must be conducted with regard to every concrete example of this oppression, as we have begun to carry on agitation around concrete examples of economic oppression. Inasmuch as this oppression affects the most diverse classes of society, inasmuch as it manifests itself in the most varied spheres of life and activity, it is not evident that we shall not be fulfilling our task to developing the political consciousness of the workers if we do not undertake the organization of the political exposure of the autocracy in all its aspects. In order to carry on agitation around concrete instances of oppression, these instances must be exposed, as it is necessary to expose factory abuses in order to carry on economic agitation. Revolutionary social democracy has always included the struggle for reforms as parts of its activity, but it utilizes economic agitation for the purpose of presenting to the government not only demands for all sorts of measures, but also and primarily the demand that it cease to be an autocratic government. Moreover, it considers its duty to present this demand to the government on the basis not of the economic struggle alone, but of all the manifestations in general of public and political life. In a word, it subordinates the struggle for reforms as the part of the whole to the revolutionary struggle for freedom and for socialism. And then Lenin goes on to say, why do the Russian workers still manifest little revolutionary activity in response to the brutal treatment of the people by the police, the persecution of religious sects, and the flogging of peasants, the outrageous censorship, the torture of soldiers, the persecution of the most innocent cultural undertakings? Is it because the economic struggle does not stimulate them to this? Because such activity does not promise palpable results? Because it produces little that is, quote, positive? To adopt such an opinion, we repeat, is merely to direct the charge where it does not belong, to blame the working masses for one's own Bernsteinism or reformism. We must blame ourselves, our lagging behind the mass movement, for still being unable to organize sufficiently wide, striking, and rapid exposures of all the shameful outrages. When we do that, and when we must and can do it, the most backward worker will understand or will feel that the students and religious sects, the peasants and the authors are being abused and outraged by those same dark forces that are oppressing and crushing him at every step of his life. Feeling that he himself will be filled with an irresistible desire to react, and he will know how to hoot the censors one day, on another day to demonstrate outside the house of a governor who has brutally suppressed a peasant uprising, on still another day to teach a lesson to the gendarmes in surplices who are doing the work of the Holy Inquisition. And so I think what Lenin is saying in here is kind of like talking about the need to unite the different sectors of society that are oppressed by capitalism, and not just in a workers' struggle. Because like with this economist economism trend that was prevalent in Germany, especially, and in Russia, a lot of them were saying, let's only focus on the worker versus boss relation, right? Let's only focus on the worker exploitation. But then you have all these other struggles. You have the fact that in the Russian Empire at the time, you had different nationalities were oppressed. Jewish people were being oppressed, Georgians, Armenians, Ukrainians, by the Russian monarchy. You had, of course, the oppression of women, which was horrible under feudalism, where women were not even allowed to educate themselves or work. And so what I got from this passage is that Lenin is saying that, although we're organizing around workers' issues, we need to unite with other sectors of society that are oppressed by these same forces of capital, and we have the same enemy. What do you think, Alexia?
Yeah, well, I think that that is a really good way of looking at it, especially with Lenin's saying that sort of expanded on Marx's "Workers of the world unite," saying to say workers and oppressed people of the world unite, because we understand, especially now with the broader perspective, that people experience different forms of oppression, of capitalist oppression. And some oppressions are especially exacerbated under capitalism. And I think that the way Lenin puts it is sort of put in a way where we can understand that we have to unite, and we can't play into this very workers only struggle, or like peasants only struggle. It's obviously something that you need to unite with in order to achieve victory over capitalism, because we understand it's a very, very difficult task. People have continuously tried, and we're still struggling today. So we have to look at uniting not as this idealistic or utopian thing, but as a necessary thing to be able to combat and overcome capitalism.
Definitely, and that includes supporting LGBTQ people. That includes supporting people who are victims of police brutality, uniting all of these forces under the working class. That's why we say victory to the working and oppressed people, because it includes people not just who are poor, but also people who are oppressed. And I wanted to ask a little bit about what's some of the work that, in line with this theme of like uniting working class struggles with like the struggles of oppressed genders and nationalities, what's some of the work that you've been involved in terms of doing that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it stretches, in a wide variety of sort of fields in sort of activism and stuff like that. When we were protesting here against the killing of 14-year-old Antonio Arce, he was killed by the Tempe police here for essentially nothing. We united in terms of the different groups that united and worked together to sort of agitate against Tempe PD here. Despite ideological differences, it was a struggle that we realized, hey, we have to work together in this. And so we worked with groups like Bold in Action. We worked with Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. We worked with Puente Human Rights Movement. And it went successfully. We had I think it was like one of the largest demonstrations in Tempe, where there was a lot of radicalization of people who realized, hey, the police aren't here to protect us. The police are here to protect property. They're here to oppress us. They're an instrument of oppression. Eventually, like, people started realizing that it's an instrument of oppression of capitalism. And so I think that part of what makes uniting so essential is that it will help us get to the socialist consciousness a lot easier, in a way that we can be able to discuss things in terms of capitalism versus us, the oppressed classes, the working classes, and stuff like that.
I like that, telling people that police and that we all have the same enemy police are defending, because when poor families get kicked out of their house, who's the first people that the banks hit up? The police, to kick them out of the house. When people are on strike demanding better wages, the first people that the bosses hit up are the police. And I think that's a good way to organize around these issues. And I know for you, you've been really active and involved in a lot of these struggles. what advice would you have for people who are new to socialism, new to revolutionary ideas? They're seeing all the bullshit that's happening with these elections, with the Democrats and Republicans. What advice do you have for people who are like wanting to study and getting involved with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, don't be intimidated by it. I feel like, when I was first starting out, I was a little intimidated with the kinds of things that we had to be reading. As communists, I wasn't really getting direction from anyone at the time when I was, like 16, 17. The thing that scared me the most was like picking up something like the Communist Manifesto and being like, what the hell is this guy talking about? But I think with time, with enough study of these different concepts, talking with your comrades, organizing within broader groups is what can help you not only understand these things, but also put them into practice. Another thing is don't be afraid of these sort of I feel like people are being threatened right now with being arrested and stuff like that, and obviously that's a very valid thing to be afraid of. But also, it's something that unfortunately we have to go through to be able to get to that point where we don't have to be arrested just for, believing that the police shouldn't be killing us right now, or believing that we should be entitled to, basic necessities, and believing that the U.S. should be out of everywhere. And, we shouldn't be prosecuted for having these very basic ideas. So I guess that would be my biggest realm of advice. And also, organize. Don't be a lone communist. Like there's only so much you can do when you're doing these things alone, or being in very, very, very small groups, like one or two people. You gotta organize with a lot more people. You gotta talk to people. Talk to people on the bus, talk to people on the light rail or the train, wherever you're going. There's always people who are thinking what you're thinking, but they might not be saying it. So, just having these conversations with workers, people who are, of the same class as you, and trying to relate yourself to their situations. And again, finding ways to, communicate with people who want to change things and want to eventually, overthrow capitalism and see a better world, a socialist world.
Most definitely. Kat had a good comment. She said, if we don't organize because we may be arrested, then the capitalist plan has worked. That's exactly right. And that's the kind of fear tactics that the capitalist class, the imperialists, use to scare people, not just here in the United States, but in other countries in Latin America, all over the world, where even just being in a union or organizing or protesting is illegal. And it's something that we can't be afraid as communists. We have to constantly keep fighting, constantly be organized, and constantly be optimistic about our class and our people, because we have to lead that movement into something that will actually bring change. And so I just want to read one last excerpt from What Is to Be Done, and I want to get your reaction to what Lenin says here in the conclusion. I thought it was a really interesting kind of summation of what he saw in Russia. He says, the history of Russian social democracy can be distinctly divided into three periods. The first period embraces about 10 years, approximately from 1884 to 1894. This was the period of the rise and consolidation of the theory and program of social democracy. The adherents of the new trend in Russia were very few in number. Social democracy existed without a working class movement, and as a political party, it was at the embryonic stage of development. The second period embraces 3 or 4 years, 1894 to 1898. In this period, social democracy appeared on the scene as a social movement, as the upsurge of the masses of the people as a political party. This is the period of its childhood and adolescence. The intelligentsia was fired with a vast and general zeal for struggle against neurotism or populism and for going among the workers. The workers displayed a general enthusiasm for strike action. And then he talks about the third period, which was prepared in 1897. And he says it was definitely cut off the second period in 1898. This was a period of disunity, disillusion, and vacillation. During adolescence, a youth's voice breaks. And so in this period, the voice of Russian social democracy began to break, to strike a false note on the one hand, and in the writings of the Messers. And then he talks about it was only the leaders who wandered about separately and drew back. The movement itself continued to grow and advance with enormous strides. The proletarian struggle spread to new strata of the workers and extended to the whole of Russia, and at the same time indirectly stimulating the revival of the democratic spirit among the students and among other sectors of the population. The political consciousness of the leaders, however, capitulated before the breadth and power of the spontaneous upsurge. Among the Social Democrats, another type had become dominant, the type of functionaries trained almost exclusively on, quote, legal Marxism literature, which proved to be all the more inadequate the more the spontaneity of the masses demanded political consciousness on the part of the leaders. The leaders not only lagged behind in regard to theory, but they sought to justify their backwardsness by all manner of high-flown arguments. Social democracy was degraded to the level of trade unionism and adherence of legal literature. So that part was kind of interesting because he talks about the evolution of socialism and the growth of it as a process, as a dialectical process, because as Marxists, we understand that everything is a process. It has its beginning, its end. There are contradictory forces within each process. You have the reformist wing, you have the revolutionary wing. And so what would you say, based on what Lenin was talking about in terms of the progression? Because in Russia, it was like within a matter of 10 or 15 years that this party was formed, and then literally after was the Russian Revolution. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think backing up a little bit and sort of contextualizing like where we're at in terms of how split these two sectors of the party were is important. So this is a point where, for the most part, they're still united. These the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks haven't necessarily split yet, but it's sort of, I guess, building up to that. And I think that eventually what you see is this split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks that sort of takes precedent, because after there starts to become a point of like deviation. There becomes an issue of like who's going to lead and who shouldn't lead. And so I think that section that you pointed to there is very important, because he's describing how Marxism essentially was sort of being misconstrued. While the people were still going, the people were still out there, trying to fight for what they believed in, and fighting for their rights. You had this sort of leadership that was saying, legal Marxism is the way to go, or like pointing towards trade unionism as the only function of the working class. And so this kind of points back to these sort of legal Marxists and Bernsteinists who are saying like, hey, the working class like can't handle this on their own. They need to only organize within the framework of trade unionism, and they need to only organize within this small little labor space that we have enclosed, especially for them. And the working class, of course, says no. We see within the coming years, a socialist revolution happens, like you said, and it makes it clear that trade unionism was not working for the working class, and people wanted to see a change that extended much more beyond this small labor movement that they were essentially being confined to. And so I think we can also like connect that back to today and say that the worker struggle isn't just about trying to get more rights within your workplace, but also liberating your whole class from the antagonism that is what's keeping it down. And the reason that you need to fight for it in the first place is because the bourgeoisie is antagonistic towards what you want. And you want higher wages, you want to be free from working excessive hours, but the bourgeoisie wants more profit. They want to basically use you like oxen, and you don't want that. So you want to be free, and so having these two diametrically opposed interests is what essentially in the Russian Revolution it's what materialized, versus what these sort of so-called like legal Marxists actually wanted, which was for, I guess, people to like slow down or to calm down essentially. But they were like no. And Lenin, he does a great job of eventually in the future writing works like State and Revolution, Left-wing communism, all these other works where he makes a really good distinction between what what Bolshevism is, what Marxist-Leninism really is. And I think those are also really important works that sort of tie into this one as well.
I'm glad you mentioned left-wing communism and infantile disorder, because actually Andres in the chat had an interesting point. He said, watch out for COINTELPRO. They're the ones with inconsistent ideological beliefs that want all the info and keep suggesting illegal stuff. And that's, like, I'm from New York originally. I live in LA now. When I was living in New York, there was always these shady ass people when we were at protests who'd be like, let's go burn shit. Let's go like destroy shit. And they were just like these kind of edgy, you know, weirdos who just wanted to like blow shit up. And at the same time, we had people who were undocumented with us. We had moms. Like, if they were to get in trouble, like, that would fuck up a lot of things for a lot of people. And so I think, on the other hand, like, alluding to that work where Lenin also advises against, there's like, on that one hand, you know, the legal, quote unquote, legal Marxists who just want to follow all the rules, work within the system and not disobey anything. But then you also have this other wing that's like, let's just go destroy everything. Let's just go be edgy. What Kropotkin called the propaganda of the deed, which has become something that certain anarchists have promoted, is like this idea that if you go out and do some edgy act of violence, that'll inspire people to carry out revolutionary ideas. And so what do you think about that trend as well, responding to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like, you know, people sort of going specifically for these sort of illegal activities and stuff like that, you know, it always comes from like a place of frustration. You know, people are tired of whatever's happening. And so I guess definitely be wary of people who it seems like it's not coming from the right place. They're just like, you know, like your friends in the shady friends in New York who are like, yeah, let's go just burn down this building. Like, yeah. Okay, like, you know, even though there's no riot happening, let's just randomly burn something down. Definitely a red flag. But I guess where we see that happening now, you know, the Black Lives Matter uprising, where we see, you know, the burning down of buildings and stuff, that's all stuff that is, you know, we view as like, you know, this is the anger of people manifesting. So like we don't look down on a precinct burning down. You know, that's 400 years of slavery being, you know, put up in flames. That's the anger of the people manifesting. So, you know, it's only what we can expect to happen. And so, you know, we look at all these different ways that people are expressing this anger. And I think that we as Marxists, you know, we can not only look at this, but, you know, we can, you know, participate in these demonstrations. We can be at the front lines of these demonstrations. And, you know, again, we don't have to adhere to this, you know, legal Marxism or whatever kind of what's being interpreted as like legal Marxism of like, you know, we have to not have a violent revolution, so, quote unquote. You know, it has to be peaceful, it has to be within the confines of the law. But then we realize the law is capitalist and the law is specifically created to protect capitalism and to protect private property. So, you know, we say no to that. And, you know, we obviously don't want to always just follow within the line of what's expected and what's so-called like, you know, legal Marxism. Obviously, we want to you know, expand, and we want to do things that, you know, mean organizing, agitating, and educating. So that's I feel like that's sort of the gist of what, you know, Marxism really is and how we participate in these movements.
Well said, Alexia. And so it's been a pleasure. We just finished reviewing and reading some excerpts from What Is to Be Done, written by Lenin in 1902. I think this work is so important in terms of understanding what's going on in the world today, if we really want to understand a revolutionary solution. And just like Alexia was talking about right now, having a scientific balanced approach where we're not fetishizing violence, but we're also not afraid to do it when it's necessary, but with the people in an organized way, in a vanguard party. And so, Alexia, just before we head out, I just wanted to ask you, how can people follow you? How can people support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so most of my handles on social media is just Comrade Alexia. I try to make it kind of easier, like, you know, easy to remember. And you can follow also the work that I do in PSL Phoenix. We have a pre-ranch here, so we have PSL Phoenix on Facebook. You can just sort of follow what we're doing on there. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's what's up. And shout out to PSL, shout out to everybody in Phoenix, shout out to everybody in the chat who's listening to this as a podcast. Again, this is Anticonquista, Anti-Imperialist Media Collective for the Latin American Caribbean diaspora. Thank you so much, Alexia. Peace out, and peace out to everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.